What's happening, guys? My name's Austin, and thanks for tuning in to another Tech Talk with Tom. And today we are going to shed a little bit of light on DevX S2. And if you don't know what that is, you should dig into the Devve white paper because it's outlined pretty good in there. But if I were to liken it to anything, I would liken it to the Amazon Web Services for blockchain, essentially. And Tom, I really want to dig into this with you because I think a lot of people don't understand the power behind what is being built here with DevX. So would you mind giving us an intro into this and kind of what you envision it to be?
Sure, yeah. So DevX broadly is a blockchain that was designed for real world use, traditional business use, expansion into when enterprises are really using, governments are using, and when it starts really expanding. So we've always kind of seen ourselves as the bridge between kind of the early, cypherpunk, anti-establishment crypto days, and then kind of the real world use of traditional world use of blockchain. Um, and so DevX was designed in that way, and our DevX S2 product is really a service, software as a service product that can let companies then implement their blockchain solutions in their own way. And so one of the things that we found, we did, for example, a project with a Fortune 50 insurance company. And one of the things that we've generally found with this company and others is that when you start working with big businesses and kind of traditional real world business, they have a very specific way of interacting, and they're not going to bend to the way crypto is done. Crypto is going to have to bend to the way they do business. And so we worked with this Fortune 50 insurance company. They had like crazy IT requirements, and we worked with their CIO and their IT department, and it was top notch, high level security, really well done. The company had their act together. They were very protective over their customers' data and their services. I mean, they really had their I's dotted and T's crossed. But then if you're going to start using blockchain, you can't take that level of rigor and then just start throwing it on smart contracts, on Ethereum, and then you also can't have your business running to a level that you start to cap out. And one of the old classic ones was CryptoKitties took off, and
Yep.
everything else on Ethereum didn't get bandwidth, right, and it drives the prices up. Or meme coins take off, and gas prices go insane. If you're a real world business, you can't have that kind of fluctuations. And so no other blockchain would have been able to solve the problems they needed solved to assure uptime, assure cost effectiveness, assure the pricing, and then mostly link in with their IT requirements. So it's a good example. So overall, I would describe DevX S2 as a philosophy for blockchain that's designed to real world business use. And I would say the biggest area of growth by far over the next decade in the blockchain space is going to be real world business use. There's always going to be these things that pop up. There was layer ones early with Ethereum, and then there's DeFi and GameFi, and then a lot of meme coin stuff right now. There's always going to be these things that kind of pop up, but the biggest areas of growth are going to be more and more just kind of traditional business use. And so, given that that's the biggest area of growth coming up in the crypto space, and I would argue, the best suited blockchain for that type of growth. I think we could utilize DevX to really become a leader in the whole blockchain space.
And so one question I have for you is I know that traditionally, and you just described it really well, but traditional businesses have pain points when it comes to moving to blockchain, whether it be not wanting to train an entire department on Solidity or having to maintain it, or having to use a publicly available layer one that just doesn't meet their requirements. Like what have you seen, and how have you guys gone about solving these issues?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest challenges we've seen are privacy. And you might not think of that, but that almost is the biggest.
Hmm.
So that was kind of the death knell of the IBM approach. IBM, created these permissioned chains, but they didn't address companies' privacy the way that they needed to. Cost is a big one. Just reliability, both in cost and performance, security. But a lot of it also is just the mentality, that enterprises have. Like when you work with an enterprise IT department, you have a bunch of people that get these procedures that they have to follow, and there's no flexibility. It's like, this is how things are done here, is what you hear, right? And if your blockchain isn't designed to work with how things are done, they're like, well, we can't do that, we're not gonna be able to move forward. So you really have to design things in a way that works for the way enterprises think. And then here's the other tricky part: is every enterprise is different, right? One company's IT requirements are different from another's. You might have a company that's managing medical records, and they have to manage HIPAA compliance, and HIPAA has hardware requirements, legal hardware requirements, that you legally cannot run on a decentralized blockchain, because you can't assure that validators that are running proof of stake or proof of work are running on hardware that meets HIPAA requirements, right? So you just can't do it. You can't move ahead. So the thing that sets us apart from everybody else, and this is the thing that sets DevX apart from all their blockchains broadly, but this is, I would argue, our single biggest competitive advantage for the DevX S2 platform as well, is our flexibility of our sharding solution. So when I say sharding, that means broadly parallelizing the processing of a blockchain. And there's a lot of sharding solutions out there. Ethereum has, a bunch of work that's going into sharding, and they're basically saying they're parallelizing their processing, but they're doing it on a proof of stake, type of implementation. And so their sharding is very different from our sharding. Our sharding, the way we parallelize, is different from anything else in the crypto space. So what we do that's different, and what makes this so powerful, is every application gets its own blockchain, and we call those shards. So if you're running a game, you get a shard for your game that maintains the assets of the game. If you're running an ESG company that you need to maintain auditability of your data for your underlying assets, you get a shard for that. If you're running an exchange, you get a shard for the exchange. And so, a lot of this, like, you kind of design these things, and they kind of make sense, but then you start implementing it and it becomes like, duh, like, why should one blockchain running a game be competing for resources and driving up costs and driving up memory usage and with an application that's completely different, ESG assets? Like, it's not a good design, for a system. And it kind of ties into the way blockchain has been designed, with that cypherpunk anti-establishment mentality. It's all one big thing. There's a master record of everything. But when you're building real world applications and you're actually architecting them, that design criteria doesn't work. Like, you can't have all the applications all running kind of on the same system. Like, imagine if all the websites out there had to all run all on one database. How
Right.
slow and horrible it would be. Like, you just can't do it, right? And so it should be kind of intuitive to people that, like, that's not going to work. Like, the current designs, the current architectures of blockchains aren't going to work for large scale, blockchain usage. So then you end up with things like layer twos and stuff, but then you're kind of undercutting the whole point and premise of blockchain when you start using layer twos or side chains or things like that. So we architected a system from the beginning with a foundational type of approach designed for these enterprise mentalities. Okay, so every application gets its own blockchain, gets its own shard, and then you can customize that shard how you need. If you're doing a high end defense application and security is the most required, this most significant requirement, you can really stack up tons of validators, make it highly Byzantine fault tolerant, right? And that's a knob you turn that adjusts between costs and security. But if you're a defense application, they have money and security is
They don't
required.
care.
So,
Yeah.
so turn that knob where it needs to be for them. If you're a single indie studio making a game, you don't need 100 validators. You just need your assets, tracked and traded in a good way. And so you build your shard around that. Another of the big things, this is another of, I would argue, maybe the second of the most important things. The first is, again, that architectural flexibility lets us design for a particular enterprise's use. The second is even the regulatory side of it. You could have 1,000 shards in 1,000 different legal jurisdictions, where each shard is customized to the regulatory or legal requirements needed for an application. And other blockchains can't do that as well. You could have shards that manage GDPR in Europe, or shards that that are only exist in California, managing their privacy laws, and other blockchains can't do that, right? And you could do it at a core level. You can manage your consensus at a core level. Different shards can have a different consensus in addition to different requirements. You can optimize over cost or throughput or memory usage, right? And so each shard is built that way. And so taking it all back then into the DevX S2 type of business, when you have an ability to architect to a customer's needs, that's the difference between using a SQL database to maintain data or Microsoft Excel, right? If
Hmm.
you try to do, you can do everything on Microsoft Excel, but it's not the best tool for the job. When you can customize it to where you need, you can make a SQL database in an analogy, right? So it's the blockchain, but you can customize to a customer's needs, and you end up, creating something that's a much better solution for them.
And as you were, explaining all of these various options and customizability that the shards have in them, I'm trying to picture like, okay, let's say somebody wanted to deploy this on Avalanche, for example, or something like that. And then it just hit me, the RESTful API, that really is the key, no pun intended. But I mean, that really is the guy that makes a lot of this accessible to the outside without having to create new departments and train up new people and things of that nature. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, totally. So again, some of the big challenges: privacy. So you can customize a shard to a enterprise's privacy requirements, cost, throughput, reliability. But integration and ease of use is one of the really big ones. And so again, if you're an enterprise, and again, enterprises don't bend to the way things are done. Things are done have to bend to the way enterprises do it, and that's because they have money and they're spending the money on it, right? So you gotta, as
Mm-hmm.
a service provider, customize what you're selling to their needs. And so if you're a big enterprise, you have your existing, any business has their existing staff. If you have to go out and hire a bunch of Solidity developers, it's got all sorts of challenges that you've never dealt with as an organization. That's tough versus having a system where you just say, here's a RESTful API that you guys that were working for us already know how to use, just integrate it into our systems, and it's easy. We for example, we developed some of our even core applications ourselves. We built our glass block marketplace, and then
Mm-hmm.
even the most core kind of application, our wallet application, using our RESTful API. And that was done by a group that didn't have any Web3 experience at all. So we hired a team. So actually, the guy that ran it and got it going was the former head of the Amazon Kindle project at Amazon, reported to Jeff Bezos. He built a global scale marketplace already. So he was designing and building our glass block marketplace. He had no Web3 experience. We hired him in, and he was, he said, I haven't done Web3 development. It's like, it's okay. You just use RESTful API. He looked at the API docs, was like, oh, okay, this is straightforward, easy to implement. He brought in a team, hired a team for us, that were all Web2 developers. And that Web2 team and he built our Glassblock marketplace and our wallet app just using the RESTful API. And so they built Web3 applications without any Web3 experience. And that's the type of thing you need if you're going to start expanding into these, kind of traditional business world uses for blockchain.
And that team still probably has very little Web3 experience, even though they've built on it. They're just
Yeah.
working with an API. That's absolutely incredible, Tom. So, last question for you. When I think of AWS, which is what we're likening it to, and cloud hosting, anyone can go create an account. You point your domain at it or whatever, and get things going. But that is like a pretty cookie cutter way of setting up hosting, even though you have some options as you go along. But setting up a shard is not, it's not so cut and dry. Like there's a lot that goes into this sort of thing. And so what do you envision this looking like over time for companies who may come in? Like, is there a requirement for them to make contact with you guys prior to, I realize there is now, but in the future, is that what you're envisioning as well?
Yeah, so eventually the goal, clearly is to have our system like AWS is now. But just like AWS, it takes time to get there. AWS has amazing tools, Google Cloud and any of the big cloud server systems. It takes time to get all of those tools in, so it'll continue to grow and be enhanced over time. But in the early days, you get things going, but you still cover the main thing people need. Like, I need to spin up a shard, needs to have these characteristics, and I need it to do these types of things. And so we're at a point now where there isn't a lot of setup really. A lot of times you just it's almost at the push of a button. We can spin up a new shard, and then you have your own shard, and then you have the RESTful API, and you can use the RESTful API to tie into it. And so there isn't a lot of setup usually that's needed. If there's things that people need to tweak, or again, if there's particular IT requirements, or it needs to be on particularly secure hardware stuff, they can come to us and we can set it up especially that way. But for most customers, it's just, we spin up a shard, here's your API key, and here's the documentation, and you can just build what you need to build. And so there's API calls, for example, like if you want to maintain a certain type of asset, you can take any JSON format. So JSON, is just basically, here's a field like name, and here's a value, the customer's name. Here's a field, the price, and a value, the product's price, right? That kind of thing. And so JSON is generic. You can make it anything you want. So we can take any type of data representation with one of our API calls and define it. And then there's other API calls that you can use to then instantiate those records. So if you're let's say you have a sword, or let's say a car with all the characteristics, its speed, handling, acceleration, right? That could be an NFT, on in DevX. So you define, this is a race car, and it has all these characteristics, and then you mint a bunch of them, so you instantiate a bunch of those. Or if you're using ESG tracking, right? Here's an IoT sensor. It's sending this data. So the JSON record would be, here's the device ID, device measurement, what the measurement is, and then you instantiate those every 30 seconds while the device is plugging along. So it's any application can define it how they need, and then just use the API calls to then feed the data in. And it can be records or assets or anything else you want to track on the blockchain.
Amazing. And so you gave me a really good segue there to the final question. Are you able to, without using names, share some of the cool use cases that you've seen iterated on, or, just something cool about it?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the big areas that we've focused on is video games. And so tying in, and this is a good way to build a product like S2, is have a real application. Like if you just build stuff in the dark, thinking this is probably what customers are going to need, then customers start using it. It always changes. Anybody that's built a business or built software, understands that, right? So building it around something that's actually being used always is the best way to build a product like DevX S2. So we've been using it for like the Litcraft universe and tracking those assets. And so one thing that's neat is you can track the assets on a mobile game. They go into a traditional game server. Then you can move those assets over to the blockchain with the push of a button. Then you could sell it on the blockchain or transfer it to somebody else, and then maybe somebody sends it to you, then you can transfer it back to the game and then use it, right? And that creates just a general web 2 web 3 bridge. So that's a pretty neat use case. I mean, that's huge. Just think of what those words mean. A generic web 2 to web 3 bridge. Yeah, that's awesome. Another of the big categories that we've looked at is ESG, environmental, social, and governance. I would argue the biggest challenge in the whole ESG space, as big as it is, tens of trillions of dollars of assets under management, the biggest challenge is transparency and auditability, and preventing things like greenwashing. So our technology is perfect to be applied into that. And so we've built, systems that track ESG data and create transparency and trust, for that data. We had done a project in the past that was a digital contact tracing. That's another good example, because it was designed in a way where you can maintain people's privacy. And so again, blockchain's a good way of keeping track of assets and records, and doing it in a way where you have needs for immutability, transparency, auditability, but also privacy. It's a good mechanism for just keeping things segmented for who gets access to what data or not. And so that was a good example of where privacy was the main driver for an application, and we designed a shard and an implementation around the privacy requirements for a company that was implementing contact tracing for their staff. And then the pandemic has kind of wound down, and we didn't move forward with that product, but it was a great example of where blockchain was a good solution. A lot of times blockchain's a square peg being forced into a round hole, but we've been finding lots of applications where blockchain is a round peg sliding nicely into a round hole. So
Absolutely amazing. Tom, Thank you so much for that explanation. And for anyone watching, if you like this content, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be coming back to you with some more Tech Talks with Tom very soon. We'll see you guys on the next video. Take care, guys.